The River Severn moved slowly that May morning, as if even the water had grown tired of the war. Mist sat low over the meadows south of Tewkesbury, softening the edges of a landscape that would, by afternoon, be transformed into something else. Entirely a killing ground. A graveyard. The final chapter of a conflict that had swallowed England whole for 16 years. On one side of the field, the Yorkist army stood in formation behind the man who had made himself England's greatest soldier, King Edward IV, tall, broad-shouldered, and completely without mercy when the moment called for it. Behind him stood thousands of hardened veterans, men who had fought at Barnet just 3 weeks before and walked away winners. Men who could smell victory and understood exactly what it cost. On the other side, the Red Rose of Lancaster made its last stand. Queen Margaret of Anjou had crossed the sea, pulled her forces together, and placed everything she had left on a 17-year-old boy, Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales, the last legitimate heir of the House of Lancaster. She had fought for that crown her entire adult life. She had spent years in exile, begged for armies, absorbed humiliation, come back to England for one final desperate gamble. What happened on that field would decide not just a battle, it would decide whether a dynasty lived or died. To understand Tewkesbury, you have to understand what the Wars of the Roses had already cost England by the spring of 1471. The conflict had started in 1455, rooted in a question medieval England could not resolve without bloodshed. Who had the legitimate right to wear the crown? On one side stood the House of Lancaster, symbolized by the Red Rose, whose claim ran through John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III. On the other stood the House of York, symbolized by the White Rose, whose claim was, by certain lines of descent, arguably the stronger of the two. This was never just a legal argument. It was a war shaped by personal vendettas, shifting loyalties, regional grudges, and the catastrophic weakness of King Henry VI. A man so completely unsuited to kingship that he had on more than one occasion collapsed into near catatonic states. While his kingdom came apart around him, Henry was pious, gentle, and almost entirely useless as a ruler. He was the wrong man for a throne that demanded iron. Into that vacuum stepped the House of York. Richard, Duke of York, declared himself the rightful heir and challenged Lancastrian authority head-on. The first battles were fought. Great lords were killed. And when Richard himself died at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, cut down in an ambush while his army was still in winter quarters, his son Edward picked up the claim and turned it into something far more dangerous. Edward of York was everything his father had been, and then some. He was physically imposing, politically sharp, and possessed of a battlefield instinct that bordered on genius. In March of 1461, at the Battle of Tewkesbury in a Yorkshire snowstorm, he shattered the Lancastrian army in what remains to this day one of the bloodiest engagements ever fought on English soil. He took London, he took the crown, became Edward. IV. Henry VI, the deposed Lancastrian king, wandered the northern countryside for years before being captured and locked in the Tower of London. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, a woman of formidable intelligence and iron will, fled to France with their young son, Edward of Westminster. She spent years chasing whatever support might restore her husband's throne. For a time, it looked like the Yorkist dynasty was settled. But Edward IV had a gift for making enemies inside his own camp. His most powerful ally, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. The man history would call the Kingmaker eventually broke with him. The reasons were complicated, wounded pride, political disagreements, a royal marriage Edward had made without bothering to consult Warwick. Warwick switched sides. He allied himself with Margaret of Anjou, the same woman he had spent years fighting against. And together they drove Edward out of England in 1470. Henry VI was released from the Tower and restored to the throne, though he was by any honest assessment more a figurehead than a king. Warwick governed in his name. Edward IV, sitting in exile in Burgundy, refused to accept what had happened. He borrowed ships, pulled together support, and in March of 1471 he landed on the Yorkshire coast. He moved south with gathering speed, pulling loyalty back from towns and lords as he went. At Barnet on April 14th, he met Warwick's army in the fog and destroyed it. Warwick died on the field. The kingmaker was finished. But Margaret of Anjou had just landed at Weymouth with her son and a fresh army. The war was not over. Margaret received the news of Barnet with the controlled steadiness of a woman who had absorbed too many disasters to be undone by one more. Warwick was dead. Her Neville allies were gone, but she still had an army. She still had her son. And she still had the west of England, where Lancastrian loyalties ran deep and where more men might yet be raised. Her plan was straightforward and sound. March north through Wales, link up with Jasper Tudor and his forces, build the army large enough to face Edward in the open field. The Severn River was the key. Cross it, reach Wales, and the campaign could be rebuilt on solid ground. Understood this perfectly. The moment he learned of Margaret's landing, he started moving west with the kind of speed that was his calling card. This was not a slow, grinding medieval march. This was an army of veterans being pushed hard by a commander who understood that every day of delay was another day. Margaret's strength grew. The pursuit became a race. Margaret's army moved through Bristol, picking up some reinforcements and supplies, though not nearly what she needed. Her commanders intended to cross the Severn at Gloucester. They sent riders ahead to get the city gates opened. Refused. Richard Beauchamp, the city's governor, held it for York and blocked the Lancastrian crossing. That single decision carried enormous consequences. The next crossing point was Tewkesbury, another 14 miles north. Margaret's army had already been marching for days through warm May weather, short on food, pushing men to their physical limits, trying to reach the river before Edward closed the trap. The Lancastrian army reached Tewkesbury on the evening of May 3rd. The men were finished. The horses were blown. Teague of Somerset, the army's primary military commander, looked over the ground south of the town and made his call. They would not try to cross the Severn that night. Men needed rest. They would stand and fight in the morning. Under the circumstances, it was probably the only realistic option. It was also the decision that sealed Lancaster's fate. The ground Somerset chose was not without its advantages. South of Tewkesbury, between the town and Edward's approaching force, lay a broken, irregular landscape of hedges, lanes, ditches, and small enclosures that would frustrate cavalry movement and make any direct assault complicated. Somerset arranged his forces in 3 divisions, the standard organization of a medieval English army. His own division held the right. Lord Wenlock commanded the center. John Courtenay, Earl of Devon, anchored the left. The Prince of Wales, 17 years old, the entire reason this army existed, was positioned in the center alongside Wenlock. Margaret herself did not take command. She pulled back with a small escort to watch from a position of relative safety. Her role now was to survive, to make sure that if the battle went wrong, the prince at least had a chance to get out. She did not yet know there was no such chance. Edward IV arrived and began positioning. His own forces on the night of May 3rd, he placed his 3 divisions opposite the Lancastrian line and put himself in the center. His youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, 18 years old and already a genuinely dangerous military mind, commanded the Yorkist right. His eldest brother, George, Duke of Clarence, a man whose loyalty had already flipped once and might flip again, commanded the Yorkist left. Edward had also taken a precaution that showed how carefully he thought about the ground in front of him, knowing that the hedges and enclosures on his left flank might hide Lancastrian ambushes. He detached 200 spearmen and placed them in a nearby wood to watch his flank and respond to any surprise. It was a quiet decision, made without ceremony. It would prove decisive. The morning of May 4th came clear and warm, an English spring morning with bird song over the hedgerows and sunlight on the Severn. Incongruously peaceful before the machinery of war started its work. Edward opened the battle with his artillery. Cannon fire rolled across the field, tearing into the Lancastrian lines, churning up the earth, forcing men to bunch and flinch behind whatever cover they could find. Also brought his archers forward, and the arrow storms began that distinctly. English method of opening a battle, turning the sky dark with shafts, grinding down morale and discipline before the infantry closed the distance. Somerset, on the Lancastrian right, watched his men absorbing punishment without being able to respond effectively. His artillery was outmatched. His archers were taking losses. And so Somerset made the most aggressive decision available to him. He was not going to stand there and take it. He would attack. What happened next is one of the most debated tactical moves of the entire Wars of the Roses. Somerset gathered his division and moved it forward and to the right, using the lanes and enclosures to cover his approach, swinging around to hit the Yorkist left flank under Clarence. It was bold. It was creative. And for a few minutes, it actually looked like it might work. His men crashed into the Yorkist left and drove hard, generating real pressure, the kind of shock that can split a line. But the Yorkist left held. Then Edward committed his center, pressing against Somerset's now exposed flank. Dan. From the small wood on Edward's left, from exactly the position where he had placed those 200 spearmen the night before, came a sudden charge directly into Somerset's rear. The trap closed with brutal efficiency. Somerset's division was caught between three forces at once. The Yorkist left pushing in from the front, Edward's center swinging against his flank, the spearmen from the wood crashing into his rear. Formation that had advanced so aggressively just minutes before simply came apart. Men broke. The survival instinct overrode every order, every sense of obligation, every awareness of what was at stake. They ran. Somerset himself survived the initial collapse, fighting hard, trying to rally men who could not be rallied. The collapse of his division swept back toward the Lancastrian center. And here the battle produced its most bitter and disputed moment. Lord Wenlock, commanding the Lancastrian center, did not advance. He did not move to support Somerset's flank attack. He did not move to cover the retreat. He stood still, and by standing still, he allowed Somerset's shattered division to crash back into the center like a wave breaking on rock. Spreading panic and confusion through men who had not yet thrown a single blow, historians have been arguing about Wenlock's inaction for centuries. Was he a traitor, secretly working for York? Was he a cautious commander, waiting for a moment that never arrived? Was he simply paralyzed by indecision as the battle moved faster than his ability to read it? The records do not give a clear answer. Somerset, covered in his men's blood, finding Wenlock motionless when he should have been moving, made his fury immediate and physical. He rode to Wenlock, struck him in the head with his battle-axe, and killed him. It was the act of a man, pushed past everything he could bear. It was also the final blow to whatever remained of Lancastrian cohesion. The center, already shaken by the return of Somerset's broken division, now watched its commander get murdered by a man on his own side. Whatever discipline and purpose had been holding those men together dissolved in that moment. Edward IV, watching the Lancastrian line fracture and fold, committed everything he had. The entire Yorkist army came forward, driving into the collapsing center and left, pushing the Lancastrians back, toward the town, toward the river, toward the abbey. The left under Devon tried to hold. It could not. The numbers were wrong. The morale was gone, and the same ground that had been chosen as a defensive advantage now became a trap. Those hedges and enclosures that had complicated Edward's advance now complicated the Lancastrian retreat. Men got separated from their units. Formations lost all cohesion. The organized defense dissolved into scattered, desperate last stands. Small groups, fighting for their lives in ditches and field corners and abbey grounds. The place where the killing was heaviest, that was called by those who survived it the Bloody Meadow. The name needed no explanation, and somewhere inside that collapsing chaos, Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales, 17 years old, the last legitimate male heir of the House of Lancaster, was killed. The accounts disagree on exactly how he died. Some sources say he fell fighting, cut down in the rout. Others say he was captured and then executed in the presence of King Edward himself. The details have been disputed and debated ever since. What is not disputed is the fact of his death and what it meant. With him died the Lancastrian succession. There was no other legitimate heir of that line, young enough, strong enough, or positioned to carry on the fight. Henry VI sat in the Tower of London, old and broken and incapable of producing another son. The future of the Red Rose had rested entirely on this young man's life. That life was over. The battle was over. The day was not. Medieval warfare had rules, not laws with enforcement. Mechanisms, but customs observed often enough to carry real weight. One of them was the right of sanctuary. A man who reached consecrated ground, who threw himself on the mercy of the church, was supposed to be safe from pursuit. The soldiers and commanders who survived the Lancastrian rout ran in every direction. Some reached the Severn and drowned trying to cross it. Some scattered into the countryside. Some made for Tewkesbury itself. For the narrow streets and the massive stone bulk of Tewkesbury Abbey, the abbey doors were opened. Men crowded inside, desperate and bleeding, believing that the cross above them meant protection. Edward IV violated that sanctuary. He entered the abbey in force. He dragged men out of the nave and the chancel. Men who had knelt before altars and begged God's mercy and believed that the rules of their civilization still held even in defeat. He arrested them. He brought them out into the daylight. A court was convened with the kind of speed that tells you the verdict was already decided before the questioning started. Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, the man who had tried to save the Lancastrian cause with one desperate flanking attack, who had killed Wenlock with his own hands, who had watched everything unravel in a single chaotic morning, was tried and condemned. He and several other surviving Lancastrian commanders were taken into Tewkesbury's marketplace and beheaded. This was not judicial process. This was the final act of a war that had decided to end itself completely. Edward had spent years fighting the same enemies in different combinations, watching defeated Lancastrians rebuild, regroup, and come back for another round. At Barnet, he had destroyed the Neville faction. At Tewkesbury, he would leave no foundation from which a Lancastrian army might grow again. The executions were methodical and deliberate. The men who died in that marketplace were not victims of battlefield rage. They were killed by calculated policy, by a king who had learned through hard experience that mercy produced future wars. Margaret of Anjou was captured in the days following the battle. She had watched from whatever vantage she could manage as the army she had rebuilt was destroyed. She had outlasted so many disasters, had endured exile and humiliation and the constant grinding weight of hope, repeatedly deferred. She had come back to England for this, the destruction of everything she had fought for, the death of her son and her own capture. She was taken to London and spent years as a prisoner before being ransomed by the French king and returned to her homeland to live out her remaining years in relative obscurity. The woman who had once moved armies across Europe and made Yorkist kings lose sleep ended her days in quiet French poverty, stripped of everything except the memory of what she had attempted. In the Tower of London, Henry VI, the mild and bewildered man whose inability to rule had set all of this in motion, died within days of Tewkesbury. The official account said he died of grief over the news of the defeat. Men who thought carefully about such things assumed the truth was simpler and darker. He was no longer useful to keep alive. Edward had a throne, a healthy young wife, and sons. There was no good reason to leave a Lancastrian figurehead breathing. Henry VI died in the Tower. On the night of May 21st, 1471, the last king of Lancaster, when the sun began to drop over the Severn on the evening of May 4th, Tewkesbury lay quiet in the particular silence that settles after catastrophe. The meadows south of the town were covered with the evidence of the morning's work: broken weapons, abandoned armor, the banners of the Red Rose trampled into the mud and the spring grass. The town absorbed the shock in stages. The abbey stood, as it had always stood, ancient and massive, stones indifferent to the violation of its sanctity. Its nave emptied now of the men who had sheltered there in their final hour. The marketplace smelled of what the marketplace had been made to smell of in the brutal arithmetic of that day. Edward IV moved through the aftermath. Like a man who had accomplished exactly what he had set out to do, he had left Barnet 3 weeks earlier with an army of veterans and the certainty that if he moved fast enough and hard enough, this war could finally be ended rather than merely paused. He had been right. In a single morning on a broken English field, the House of Lancaster had been taken apart at every joint. Its prince was dead. Its great commanders were executed. Its figurehead king would not survive the month. Its queen was in chains. There was no Lancastrian heir left to contest the throne, no Lancastrian army left to fight, no Lancastrian hope left to sustain another decade of civil war. For the soldiers who had fought under both banners that morning, the Yorkist men who had broken the Red Rose's last formation, and the Lancastrian survivors who had run from the bloody meadow and hidden in ditches and prayed in abbey doorways, the battle was the end of something enormous. They had spent their adult lives in a country at war with itself, where loyalty was a calculation that could be reversed overnight, where great lords could be alive and powerful at dawn and dead by sunset. They had marched and camped and fought, and buried friends, and kept marching. Now, on this spring evening beside the Severn, it was done. The Red Rose had given everything it had to give. It had burned through its last prince, its last great duke, its last army, its last chance at a river crossing that might have saved it. The White Rose held the field. The White Rose held England. And in the quiet of the bloody meadow where the grass would grow dark and rich in the seasons ahead, the Wars of the Roses ended, not with a treaty or a ceremony, but with the simple, definitive silence of a cause that had finally run out of men.